Just complete them. Then what else do I do? Here. Ai là Hey. Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Struggling to get the live on Facebook right now. There's a,
Okay.
yeah. Can you access the article?
Yes, but I only managed to skim through.
No problem. Interesting, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh my god. I cannot. Again. Hey, never mind. Can't get the live going. Why? Mine is okay. I can't get the live going, but let's just start now. Is everyone here? Is it just me? Oh, and there's more people coming in. Right. How do you guys find the article?
Hello.
I Today I'm having difficulty sending the PT to Facebook. So yeah, we just gotta do it on Zoom.
I don't think I'll be staying for long. I'm waiting for dinner to come.
We can eat dinner in front of us.
It's Mother's Day.
Oh yeah, sorry for Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day, everyone. Happy Mother's Day lah.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. So I was reading like the article. Let's start, and then I mean, you guys want to start like which part that you guys find like fascinating, or share some thoughts. No. Should I start? Okay, I will start then. Ying won't be joining us today. She's like super busy this week. So on page 58, right? That's on page 58. Page 58. I will share I'll share the screen to you. Can do that. Share screen. My sharing. I'll show the entire screen. See? Yeah. The article mainly talks about Sago Lane in Chinatown, right? Then there's the Death House, and then they talk about the Kongsi culture, the spinsters home. That is like, I think right now they are all HDB and right at the relic choose and then the Kongsi culture was like they talk about this group of early migrant workers that are all female that came to work in Singapore. They're all Cantonese and then happens to be from Sunde, this place. My ancestry actually is from Sunde. So I hear about a lot of story from my mom, my parents, and my grandparents.
Oh, cool.
But interestingly, right, like to us, there's no stigma to it at all. But some of the myths that talk about like how they might be group of lesbian like, choose to like stay together, like that was vaguely talked about with my parents as well. And when I try to understand as a kid of like they do not have a stigma of like, oh, maybe they are lesbian or it's a bad thing. Yeah. We call it market. Then when we talk about them, it's actually some kind of like very respectful because it's a group of women choose to live their life. No, but then reading from this article, I'm quite shocked that they have this kind of really bad stigma that is stuck with them. Wait. How do I monitor this? Okay. Can we everyone can we voice of I mean can read it out loud?
Sorry, I think your voice is like cutting in and out.
Oh really? Like
Like
the
it goes in and out.
oh okay. I will start reading from like the red line as described by anthropologist Benjamin Copley in 1959. The Kongsi were at root boarding house for unmarried women. They had begun as a new institution in Guangdong province. When a boom in demand had positioned Cantonese women for the first time as wage earner in a colonial economy, the ability to earn in a broader market has reduced the dependency of young women upon their family for support. This helped in part to propel the growth of secret anti-marriage societies beginning in Shenzhen, county on the Pearl River Delta that were focused upon the Kongsi as an alternative to the traditional path of matrimony and patriarchal resettlement to the husband's family. Members of the anti-marriage society took vows not to wed. If forced by their family into arranged marriage, they took vows never to cohabit with the spouses. To save faces, anti-marriage society members were often wed to absent migrant workers in a form of proxy marriage, in which a white rooster stood in lieu of the husband at the nuptial ceremony. Although the wife and the husband frequently never met, the rooster was taken along for family visit and other marital and filial obligation. Can you hear? Yeah. So back then, from our perspective, right, like talk about myth, or not myth. I mean, talk about like oral history from my family part. We always see this the ceremony as the very how to say sacred thing. Like is the marriage here? Like they give me more insight of how the ceremony came about. Like when they took the vow and all that, it's like the whole like family or related people will come together to witness the Majie actually go through the whole ritual.
It's in the vow not to marry.
Yeah, to get the rooster, the gongji, the chicken, to like do the rituals. Yeah, I didn't know that it's because of the to fulfill the marital the filial obligations. So yeah, that's really interesting on my part. Yeah. Anybody else want to share?
So the white rooster is not done where they're from, but is it also practiced in Singapore as well for the Majes? Do you know about this?
From what I understand is that they actually took the vow in China. And they are where the family of the Majie is from. Yeah, because it's done in front of the family. And then they were sent to various family. The Majie culture is not only in Singapore. Like I know a lot of Hong Kong family they have Majie, or even in China they have Majie.
There's a photographer in Singapore who actually did a Maje photo essay. Her name is Charmaine Ho. There's some Majes that are still alive in Singapore, and they still stay in like their Maja quarters, and they still have their Maja practices like their comb and their some other on like objects that they still possess to show that they are a Maja, even though they don't have any families that they're taking care of. And I think one of the Maja was like 100 years old. And they all would like hang out at the Chinatown, the one at near Sago Lane, at the I forgot which block is it. It's near the Smith Street.
Oh.
Yeah, so there's a old folks area there. So some of the Majas actually like hang out there for recreation or like to just spend time socially with other old folks.
I was always fascinated when I first came to Singapore as a kid. Like when I like Chinatown a lot because that's the only place I can speak Cantonese to everyone. Yeah, my Chinese and English wasn't good at all at that point. So I needed somewhere to like I can associate with. So yeah. Now that I know, like reading this article, how this culture came from, like it's quite special. Like in Chinatown, really everyone can speak Cantonese. Yeah. Then for Xiaomi Po, should I pull out the? Maybe I can do a quick Google and then show everyone the website. Yeah, let me stop sharing screen. You guys can like mingle and talk a bit before I can show you guys anything. Actually, the room is quite crowded. Why is only like 4 of us like have our camera on and talking to each other? What happened to the rest of people?
Actually, I thought what was very interesting about what I thought was very interesting about this text is how it makes a link between like singlehood for females and like ghosts. I thought it was really interesting. And then like there was one sentence, I can't remember which part, but then it was something like how single women are like a vector for destruction. I thought that was like, wow, this is next level. And I think it's very interesting, like the whole idea that, especially when you talk about like colonial or patriarchal culture, anything that's like occult or like from like these types of, if you talk about witches or ghosts, it's considered like deviant. And then I feel like this text takes it to the next level and links it all together. So I thought that was a very interesting point that the text is trying to argue for. Then there also has this word necropolitics or necropolitical, like towards the end of the article. I have never seen that word before, but I thought it was a very interesting like way of framing this discussion. And then obviously it frames it in a way that says like you can use the necropolitical to create cultural capital and create value in terms of like, financial and monetary value. So there's some very interesting points that this article makes, but I haven't really processed it. So, I mean, yeah, that would be something interesting for me to like discuss.
Is it the same paragraph as where he bring up biopower?
Yeah, correct, yes.
Yeah, we can slowly go to that part. I'm just waiting for everyone to like get familiarized with the article. I'm sure not everyone have read the entire article yet. But I mean, if like no one going to share part by part, I'm gonna start reading some of or sharing the screen with everyone on the part. But yes, everyone, please don't be shy and then come onto your camera, like show your face, like talk to everyone. Yeah, I was showing this because Ila just now mentioned, like we were talking about Ma Jie. Then Ila mentioned that there's this Singaporean artist, Charmaine Poh, who did a documentation photo essay on Ma Jie that is still in Singapore. So here is I'll share the link as well on the group chat. Okay.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. I never really thought about it before, but how it describes the Ma Jie and the space as like a space of resistance within the Confucian context.
I didn't know that they are faced with so many pushback for their way of living. Yeah.
So the ceremony of the rooster is supposed to hide the fact that they took a vow not to wed, is it? I don't really know.
But like in China, there's this weird culture that they also wed people who have passed away. Like because they believe that only through union or like this ceremony then the soul can rest or something like that. Right?
They actually have that in a temple in Tanjong Pagar. They actually do ceremony for ghosts I can send you guys the link.
I mean, actually, halfway when I'm reading this article, I feel really creeped out. Also, because at some part that he actually mentioned about like how people are feeling like nauseous when doing the construction. And I don't know, is it like my mind like playing trick with me or something? I actually feel a bit nauseous as I was reading that part. Yeah. Wait, so next paragraph. I mean, if you guys have a particular paragraph that you want to share, we just now I was sharing on page 58. So like the next part I want to talk about is actually in page 60. If in between there's any passage that you all want to go through together, then let me know that I pull out the screen to let everyone read that part. So here,
Like sidetrack a bit, I'm actually wondering what's going to happen to Hungry Ghost Festival this year, because it's such a big thing in Singapore, and given the new measures, whether that it will actually take place. Then I'm also thinking about how like spirits will be anxious in that sense, because there's no offerings in that, you know, in that skill probably taking place. So what does that, how does that change the city's like spiritual psyche, especially for offerings for ancestors and all that? How does it get carried on, where you can still make offerings but not in public? Whether there's any kind of alternative ways of doing it, because I know like there are some stories that I've collected of people who have not given offerings to their ancestors for a long time, and then the ancestors actually come back to possess some family members who are more vulnerable, to actually like just tell them like, hey, like give me some offerings, you know, like I'm like completely like not surviving in the underworld because you haven't been making offerings for me. So there are stories like that has happened. Yeah.
I heard of people actually come to like how to say, they come to the dreams to tell their children like, oh, you need to come see me more often and things like that. Yeah, and then yeah, strange story to share. A bit personal also. Like I think 2 years ago, my mom is like brought me to see some kind of fortune teller, saying like my daughter's like love life is not going so smoothly, and then asked what's going on with her. Then the fortune teller is kind of like did the, I think she's some kind of medium, like talk to the ancestor. Then at the process, then she was saying, because you guys didn't like do the funeral rites like very thoroughly, like didn't talk to the ancestors as much and things like that, that's affecting all your grandchildren in the life, and then your ancestry like is not sorted out clearly, they are missing members, things like that. That's what my mom was told. Then we were like, oh shit, like who do you forget that it's not, so our family are not taken care of for their afterlife and things like that.
No.
Okay, then yeah, let me share the page 60 with you guys. I don't know whether this is
So did you manage to sort it out, Winnie?
me. It's like it depends on my dad, or like, because I don't know who's like missing, because there's a lot of like funny family myth from, because the originally my family was in Sunde where the Majie was from, and then the family curse. Someone had we had a very powerful auntie in the family that are like managing the whole household. The stories are a little bit like the Emily from Emerald Hill.
Oh, okay.
Manage the whole family, and then there's one of the son that got married with who I think it's my great grandfather, who's a doctor, then got married with a hostess, but he's madly in love with her. Then I think the housemaster is like, the auntie is not happy with her, so she committed suicide or something like that. And then after that, my family is kind of cursed. Then we are forced to leave Sunde. Like until this point of time, my dad did not allow me to go back. Like to stay overnight. Like I can go there to like have dinner or like try to look at Sunda as a city, but then I can never stay overnight over there. So I guess like my dad is trying to trace, is it that auntie or things like that that is not taken care of? Like it's quite the, if talking about biopower in that sense, it's like it's fascinating how it actually affects us like years on. Like we literally have to like trace like, oh, what's the missing link, like who do we not account for in our family? Is it because there is someone that we never put in the we call it 祠堂, like the what is 祠堂 called in English, like the family temple, things like that. So yeah, that was like 3 years ago. And then the story was like my grandfather's dad. So that's great grandfather. How many years ago? At least 100. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. I was like at like page 60 here actually. Let's look at it. I was fascinated in like the like. Am I moving away from the Majie part too fast? Because I was like thinking like how it actually in this paragraph they compare the state as the husband figure, and then how it actually is not happy with the whole matriarchic or anything that is like outside of what they thought that is suitable. And it because Josh is a geographer. Is that how you call it? He specializes in geography, and then he uses the way that we manage our city in terms of landscape in compared to like how the city is. And then there's this paragraph in this whole session that I feel very disturbed with. The decade of 1970s also saw a sweeping cleaning campaign by the PAP of both perceived physical and cultural pollutant. Example of degraded Western or so-called unhealthy or yellow culture became targets of the states, as well as bohemian trappings such as long hair and loud music. At the same time, low-grade or suspect housing as well as untended landscape came to be replaced by newer, tidier constructions. This was the dawn of the garden city concept for the island, the first clearly realized vision of what was to become the Singaporean landscape. The latter was no simple undertaking and had to be created largely ex nihilo when Stamford first landed in Singapore in 1890. The island was actually, I need to share what's the best way to do this. What's this? Okay, here. Okay. Sorry, lost it halfway. Trying to find the part of the article. Sorry, here. Predominantly covered in dactylocap. What's dactylocap forest? Anyone know? Okay, never mind.
It's like a type of tree, lah.
Okay,
Yeah,
surrounded by coastal
biological classification of trees.
Okay, because of the colonial period. It was created at a principally agricultural landscape. Pineapple, coconut, tapioca, peppers were grown in the interior. And the coastal mangrove was eradicated to create posts for prawn farming. Various waves of increasing and diminishing demands brought continual change on the island ecology, but the effect on the dactylocap forest was lasting and permanent. And by 1850, the last remaining scrap of the indigenous landscape was around the Bukit Timah Highlands, where a steep topography made cultivation impossible. In the meantime, the broad exchange of plant species among the British colony and their intentional translation project of plant acclimatization have flooded Singapore with species from Southeast and South Asia, Australia, and even from Europe and Brazil. By the time PAP set about replacing scurvy landscape with a tidy and consistent local style, virtually nothing on the island could be found as heritage stock, as Richard Collett had noted in his ecological history of the island. None of the species extant in urban Singapore were there when Raffles arrived. That's such an ambitious project, isn't it? It's like very similar to like what's it called? Tarographing, like changing the whole land. And what can give someone the idea like what a nation can be in even in the biological form, you know, like how do you decide like, oh, this is a Singaporean style of tree, things like that. Like I was just fascinated with, I mean, also like really scary with like, I really like creeped out by this whole movement. Hello, everyone.
Yeah, I think I think the parallel, like if you draw the parallel to how the government's trying to manage the people, and also like trying to, like what it says, like cultivating social structures, then the same result happens like when he talks about how the landscape needs constant maintenance, and it cannot like, it's not very resilient, right? It needs a help to survive. And then similarly, like our social structures, like we become very dependent on the government. So I thought it was an interesting comparison.
So I've been reading this book called Braiding Sweetgrass. So it's about how to combine like indigenous wisdom with scientific knowledge. And it talks, one of the things that the book talks about is how like Native Americans would plant like corn, squash, and wheat like together, and it actually looks very messy, like because it's a symbiotic relationship. But then like when the colonizers came to America, they decided to do like more monoculture kind of way of planting. So everything is like in straight lines, in grids, and then that allows them to grow more crops. But at the same time, there's like when you grow things symbiotically, like when you grow three plants together, it actually prevents things like pests, and it prevents like weed infestation. But then when you grow the monocrops, like it actually makes it more vulnerable to pests. So it's very interesting, like this reading of like husbandry is like actually, you know, it's like this idea, oh, we're gonna do things this way because it's more effective, but actually like it creates more problems at the same time. So the word husbandry here to me is very interesting. It's like the idea that you have to kind of tame nature, and then like there's kind of this patriarchal like reading to it as well. Like there was this thread on social media about how a lot of the southern islands in Singapore, like a lot of them were forced to move, right? And then like now they're converted to landfills and things like that. And then it's like the kind of just settler colonial violence that has happened is like, yeah, I don't know, like it just, the word husbandry for me like links to this, and it's like something that a lot of people are talking about on social media at the moment. But yeah, that's what I was thinking about with this paragraph.
I think like echoing Race, right? Like we were at we went to Green Circle Eco Farm to actually understand like this kind of like more non-monocultural way of planting. So the lady who runs the farm, her name is Irene, I think. It's really like she's super hardcore, super gangster about how things are done. She believed that when we talk about this notion of diversity, the more we mix up, as in the kind of different plants, different things all together instead of putting them separately, the more it will thrive. because they have a very strong interspecies relationship that makes it more robust in terms of how long it can sustain. And it's, I think, like when they use the word husbandry here, is also this notion of possession, because the husband possess when they marry, they are the one that is in control. They are the one that, if you think about the hierarchy of a marriage, the husband is the one that is especially in patriarchal society, the husband is the one that sets the rules, sets the framework, sets the structure. They set the guidelines on how a marriage should take should be experienced. So I think that's a very good word to actually use to describe the paragraph. Yeah, because there is that kind of possession. You possess something and then you change it to accordance to how you feel is the right way to control the or like you mentioned, to tame, to neaten, or like to even make it very sterile and very very cosmetic, very pretty, much like a wife. Like you adorn the wife, you make the wife pretty, you make the wife look good. So I guess that's how we see the kind of spaces of nature here. Is very cosmetic, is very clean up, is very easily accessible. Yeah, and it's not wild.
Yeah, one thing I found quite interesting as well is this idea that it's this is kind of fiction that is maintained through the maintenance of the garden, right? It's not just done because they think it's an efficient way to go about farming, for instance. It's done because you need to use it to attract investors. This is kind of different economic logic that now overlaps with how people manage the environment. And yeah, I think I read the same thread that you did, Riz. Is it the one about how like Pulau Semakau and other places, they had to move out and like they were relocated to one-room flats and things like that. Yeah, I think it's quite interesting to think of that as a kind of colonial violence as well, like you said, because I think this idea that even when it's a space that used to be considered like one of with the community, ends up being kind of subordinated to a developmental logic that's used as one part of a system when it comes to, let's say, waste management or like quarantine facilities or used for military training with Tekong, that kind of thing. So I think it's an idea that you can't really differentiate space within Singapore anymore, because all of it is vulnerable and all of it is legitimately part of what the state can intervene in. So I think that's what the idea of like biopower really is, why it's so interesting, right? It's the idea that in the past, states used to maybe rule through consent or coercion, but then nowadays it's kind of like taken on the power over life and death itself, which I think is the whole idea of necropolitics as well. What is a legitimate object of intervention for the state and for governance? Yeah, just my thoughts reading like this part of the article so far.
Hi. Are you following so far?
Yes. Yeah, I am. Are we sharing thoughts about the article?
Yeah. Yes, actually. Yes.
Yes, sorry. Just give me a minute now. I think when I read this, I told myself when I go back to Singapore, I must really look around Sago Lane and then kind of see what's happening, and to have a lived experience and really look at the spatialities. And I think what I was curious about is how much of these erased histories can still be palpable. Yeah, like I was thinking, if I didn't read this article and I'm standing in the midst of Sago Lane, will I actually realize a lot of these confluences of history, the biopolitics behind it? And I think perhaps what was thinking very hard about is then, as a person who is hoping to contribute to Singapore, how do we then make sense of such histories that may not be around from a physical marker point of view? And I remember when I was in London, they have these guided tours, these street tours, that they will bring us around like the secret alleys, and then they would tell us stories. And I thought it was really quite an interesting way of recuperating quite a lot of these histories as well. And I'm imagining in a very shiny veneer of Singapore, where, Sago Lane, I'm imagining you can see a lot of the powerful names and emblazoned on various skyscrapers, whether those kinds of stories that become a different kind of lived realities would kind of challenge the idea of Singapore as a beautiful cosmopolitan city-state. So those are some of the thoughts, and wondering, if there's actually anything going on like that in Chinatown currently, in terms of guided tours. I think the other thing that kind of intrigued me was the article that talked a bit about the Kongsi, and then how it was related to the spinsters, that it kind of provided funeral money as well, and how it was a kind of discomfort, and to me, it just made me wonder whether this kind of so-called civil society action that discomforts the state, are there any around right now? Yeah, and how do we continue to think along such trajectories as well? I ask this because I think as I read the article, I think what really haunts me is the powerful ability of Singapore to erase a lot of things. So it's how should I say, I constantly ask, how do we unearth, how do we recuperate, how do we look for lost memories and lost histories like these when we may not even know that it existed in the first place. Yeah, so I think having interventions from people who are in architecture, from SDE, from history is helpful. But I'm just wondering if a further step needs to be taken, and that is these lost histories become a different kind of lived reality in the present. So I was just wondering, that's why, whether different kinds of guided tours could be that kind of intervention from the ground up. Yeah, just some thoughts on that. Yeah.
I was actually thinking about the guided tour points, because in my university, there's a pretty interesting way they go about doing tours. So I study in Oxford, and obviously it's an institution that's been complicit a lot of times in colonial
I remember going for one of those, yeah.
violence. Yeah, was it with Uncountable Oxford? I think that was that the group. Yeah. So I think the idea is that if you do it in Singapore, you need to be a regulated tour guide, for instance. I think even if you go and look on Airbnb, for example, those kind of walking tours that locals can do, all of them will list that they are licensed tour guides, because I think presumably there's some sort of action that's taken against you if you try and represent alternate histories, or it's probably regulated through an economic framework, but I think it's the idea that no one else, there's a state monopoly on what is official history and what isn't. I think the other thing that I think about when I look at this compared to the UK is this idea of who decides what is heritage and who isn't. So for instance, those blue plugs you see around London, some bloke lived here, he invented the steam engine or something. Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because you can actually apply for that as a local organization. You can be a village committee, you can be just a guy living in the apartment, and they can write into the National Trust or whoever it is that regulates them. And you can kind of get a plot approved and written. Whereas in here, I think it's a very top-down process, right? NHB always kind of frames it as a consultative kind of thing, where they kind of open the floodgates of it. You can kind of petition to have your place recognized, and then when the exercise is done, it's kind of done. So I think that's a big difference as well. Yeah, and the other kind of state-sanctioned catalogs almost, right? I'm looking at the Sago Lane thing on Infopedia, which of course is a Singaporean government agency website, as the banner on the thing tells you. And they use kind of violence language at times, right? Look at, if you go on it right now, send a link in the chat, right? You see the 12th footnote, in the early 70s resulted in part of Sago Lane being expunged, right? It's kind of a violence word almost, the idea that it's kind of stripped out of history, but it's just left there. And then afterwards it just goes into this really banal section on variants names, right? It's also known as Sai Yun Kai. And then it goes into the authors, and that's it. It's kind of like a one-liner as to how it disappeared, right? That's where the article ends. Now it's just part of the temple complex. And I think my final thought about this is just how, yeah, you're right that if you're not there, it's kind of hard to experience what's so strange about the place. I've actually walked past Sago Lane a lot of times, but only ever as a kind of shortcut to other places in the area, right? It's a very nice cafe in the area. It's kind of near Chinatown MRT. It's not really it's a liminal space almost, rather than a kind of place that you stop to experience. Possibly because the road itself is dominated by the temple complex nearby as well, that houses the relic. Yeah, just my thoughts in response to what you said.
I'll share a bit about my own experience of going to Sago Lane as well. because in the first few paragraphs of this article, they actually talk about the empty grass plot that's in between Sago Lane and the temple itself. I went on to Google Maps to street view it, what it looks like now. It's actually a car park. Yeah, the empty space that you're talking about has been turned to a car park. So the last time I was at Sago Lane was actually with the army. We had a national education tour. So they brought us to all the so-called ethnic enclaves. So I remember when we were at the tour place itself, they had like a tour guide who was probably from some government agency. I don't know, because I went off to buy ice cream. But anyway, while I was buying ice cream with my friends, there was these people doing qigong in the open space next to the temple. And you could see a lot of like the Amua tourists were actually just like eating the ice cream with us and watching the people doing their qigong on their own and listening to the music and kind of just soaking in the atmosphere. So I think that part of Sago Lane now is very interesting to me because it's kind of a dual use space between for the locals themselves, especially the older generation who still live in Chinatown, who still eat at the Smith Street Hawker Center or whatever. But it's also something that is used primarily for tourists because there are all these like tourist plaques or tourist information centers. And I find it very hard to kind of match these two identities of Chinatown itself together because on one hand it's something that the older generation has been used to and the space they've been using for so long, but it's also something that has been kind of designed and like specially marketed in such a way to be as attractive to tourists as possible. So I was wondering if you all had any thoughts on that as well.
In the later part of the article, he did mention like about how they're trying to capitalize this spookiness. And do you know Hopa Villa?
Yes, been there.
I think recently they are going to transform it into a museum of death or hell. Yeah, so basically they're trying to make it to be the place to talk about death and in relation to our what they call local culture, like how different culture actually deals with death as well as the rituals and all that. Then I mean that and also like this tour in like going to spooky places or like places with haunted history actually resonate, and I'm sure they're going to do something about the Changi Hospital also. But yeah, and I'm quite shocked that actually like to conduct tours in Singapore you need this kind of license. Like you can't do like let's say like maybe like next week I post a Facebook, Instagram thing like, oh let's have a haunted tour.
I think you can do it. Like I feel like there's the business aspect of it. If you want to monetize, you want to sell your tour tickets, then you have to be a licensed tour guide. But there are some like I mean there's two ways to it, right? Like the state of course wants to control a certain kind of narrative. So like even in the article they mentioned about how Theatre Works did I haven't read that part properly, but how they actually did a piece on deaf houses, and it was actually I think last year there's this drama box actually did something called Chinatown Crossings, which is also a tour component around Chinatown that has a theatre piece within it as well. So they actually do site specific. So you walk through Chinatown and then at different points of Chinatown you stop and then you watch a theatre piece unfold with like 2 or 3 characters, and then you get to know more about the histories, like what used to be here and all that. And that one they actually got co-opted by Singapore Tourism Board to actually do the piece. So it's still very much state control, but there were some parts they actually talk about deaf houses, they actually talk about amas as well. They talk about how there are other people staying there that's not exclusively Chinese. So one of the characters is actually an Indian. How there were a lot of like not state kind of multiculturalism that was happening, but it's something that is very ground up kind of multiculturalism. So I think like when we talk about tours, we have to be careful also like how these narratives are then shaped, because the sources of what we have for these narratives is still very much what we can find through readings, and that is also operating on what is allowed. but what is the things that have not been shared, or what goes through oral exchanges, what are more personal stories that you just shared with us, the personal stories of your family. And I feel that is more precious, and that has a lot more complexities in terms of what it addresses, as opposed to something that you can read through, let's say, an article, because that is still very much something that they probably research on, that does not involve the people living there or used to live there, or the actual histories that have passed from mouth to mouth, or through oral histories themselves. So that's my thoughts on tours. I feel like tours are a very like almost precarious way of accessing this information, and how it can also exclude certain narratives accidentally. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for the tours, I was thinking it more from a strategic point of view, as in, so the tours don't have to be formalized. So it could always be on the pretext that, you know, a group of friends go out. Of course, I don't know what's the stipulation now in Singapore that, you know, in terms of public gathering, more than how many is illegal. But we could always come under such pretexts. You know, we could take different parts of Sago Lane, we can talk about it. Because I think one shortcoming about these guided tours, which I realized, is that there's very little space and time for the same group of people to sit down to talk about what they've experienced, and then think about the kinds of discourses or ideologies that we've just experienced. Because sometimes when we're very new to such things and we experience it from a rather visceral point of view, maybe in my experience, I would need more time and space to learn how to articulate it, and then to hear from people, and then that kind of formulates how I start to think about space, histories, and things like that. So I'm just wondering whether in that kind of wanting to introduce different kinds of narratives, we don't have to wait to formalize, or that there always has to be a top-down approach of approval, but whether we can work in such informal spaces under the pretext of just people chilling out, you know, finding out, and then have these very informal discussions, because they're ephemeral in that sense. Nobody's going to capture it, nobody's going to upload anything. But these experiences stay with us, the conversations, certain ideas that have resonated, sparked, or caused some form of dissonance with us. Hopefully that also creates a kind of curiosity about Singapore spaces. So in that sense, it's also lived realities, because we may pass by certain spaces. It may also be lived realities. The next time we look at a space, we can't really look at it in the same way anymore. That maybe biopolitics, notions of erasures, notions of violence, those kinds of things start to stick in our head as well. I don't know whether I'm naive, but I mean, I really think if you know, groups of us could venture on something like that, what kind of conversations could we possibly have?
I think there are some people who are already doing some of that at the moment. Like Himan Chong, he does walks with people, like 4-hour-long walks through the CBD area, where he would sometimes share like what does this like. We went, so the one that I went through the underpass from Tanjong Pagar, and we ended up all the way at Old Airport Road, and we actually passed by the PSA area, and we actually saw the cargos, and then he was telling us about like different architectural facets of those areas, and was really interesting in terms of, especially there were actually small boats that were there that act as like grab taxis for ships if they need supplies, and all these things are we're not aware of, even though like I'm a Singaporean and I've walked through there before, but I've never really seen it. There are some people who do walks as well, that's more like word of mouth, like it's not advertised, or it's not something that you can buy tickets for. So this initiatives has been happening. For myself, I've been collecting ghost stories as part of my practice, because I felt that ghost stories were the way to understand like the city psyche, and I've been collecting them since 2018. And I have a lot of stories, especially in areas where there's a lot of like land reclamation, like in the east. Ghosts are like the one of the characters that are like the main, like prevalent in those areas, like Katong, East Coast. Like you stay there, you sure got like some ghost story to share. And then like you have like different kind of ghosts when you go up towards Woodlands, and then there are some ghost stories that were shared. I mean, all these are personal stories that were shared because they suffered some economic shifts in their family. So there was some economic stress that they had to go through, like Asian financial crisis actually made, like, there's one story where it made this her parents lost their jobs, and so all the family had to start working, and then suddenly the house became haunted. So this kind of stories, I feel like, talks about the city's psyche without directly having to specify a certain place and space. And it also talks about like kampungs that have been removed violently as well. You know, what are the kind of residues that are left behind from this removal? Yeah, so things like that.
So how does the everyday person get his or her hands on such informal information being passed?
We can start a tour.
I mean, if I hear about a tour, I can let like Winnie know, and Winnie can spread the word.
Yes,
Yeah.
or actually, like, you know, like maybe one day all of us, like, you can leave your contact here. We can start a tour, something like that. Walking around. Let's start in Sago Lane first.
Yeah, but I think discussing the idea of tours also shows the kind of limits of resistance, right? Insofar as, like, I mean, all of us in these kind of tour networks are probably going to be some sort of like social science, humanities type, you know, familiar. You probably like hang out with other people who are knowing the same thing. I think the interesting thing is to see like what other tours that are more public do. So I think there are cases where, for instance, Book It Brown, I think, has a very successful thing where you can go on one of those ticketing websites. You know, every week is a tour, 4 different ones. They walk along a set route, they talk about it. It's kind of scripted, but I think at the same time it does offer the kind of opportunity for discussion and reflection, because the walk itself, of course, is like, you know, it's kind of distraction free, right? When you're going back to the MRT together, that kind of thing. I think that's when you can think about this sort of thing. But at the same time, without kind of changing the space itself, I think it's quite difficult to leave any lasting impact on, you know, how the history of the area is perceived, right? Like, who are we rewriting histories for? You know, if like tourists, for instance, or like the everyday person passing through Chinatown doesn't really understand the history of it, then you know, what really happens, right? The kind of fiction of engineering out these histories kind of is successful in the end, when nothing really is kind of changed with the physical landscape itself. I mean, just my thoughts. There's a kind of pessimism about this kind of structural force they're trying to fight against, I think. But yeah, just my thoughts on it as well.
If I may, while I agree with like Ernest and Wei Sheng, right, I also believe sort of in the institutional framework as well, because, you know, you cited the example of Oxford before, and, you know, as a university town, and a top university town nonetheless, it's Oxbridge, they would already have an existing highly developed civil society framework, which unfortunately, like, the truth is that Singapore doesn't have that. It's not, you know, it doesn't help that it's being stymied by the government regularly. And I think part of it is just waiting for the framework to develop, which requires a lot of interdisciplinary work. You know, we don't have exactly, you know, the equivalent of a Pitt Rivers Museum, nor the anthropologists, historians, archaeologists behind those as well. Because, you know, as a country, we don't even have a proper, aside from the Yale NUS faculty, we don't even have a proper anthropology faculty, you know, and extracting a narrative requires the proper expertise, you know, ethnographic, historical, or otherwise, that we simply don't, I would say that we don't have the proper manpower to do, and the folks at the NHB or the STB don't hire, you know, anthropologists with the right background and stuff, you know. And there are a lot of like ground up initiatives, like Ila mentioned too, Drama Box and Heman Chong, right? And if I may add, there's My Community, there's the Substation, and the Singapore Heritage Society as well. Those are the first things that come into mind, you know. And it's just a matter of letting these sort of institutions grow, and a matter of reconciling with, I would say, the government as well, because they're the ones ultimately who provide the funding at times.
Yeah, I mean, I'm perhaps thinking more in terms of, I mean, since we are thinking about space, if I think about civil society as a space as well, I think it can allow different actors, different kinds of frameworks. Institutional frameworks, we most probably do need them, but I'm thinking if we look at this from an institutional or space point of view, then the next thing I want to think about is the kinds of narratives. There's no one main narrative as well. So of course, institutions would push out certain kinds of narratives. Then I think the question is whether people like you and I, or people who have similar interests in exploring different kinds of histories or narratives, can also participate in civil space without waiting for certain institutional frameworks or structures to kick in, such that, you know, then they become platforms for us to participate. So maybe that's something that I'm stretching, whether in informal spaces like these are the pockets of time and space that we can try and experiment, you know, rethink certain narratives that we are so used to growing up. And I don't want to, on the offset, say that institutional narratives and what other actors are trying to do are always oppositional. I think that's a bit naive and it doesn't help as well. But I think we need to have such space, yeah, for different narratives, different ideas and frameworks. And I think coming back to the tour is just an operationalized platform. I think it's not a be-all and all thing. There are many other ways that histories that have been suppressed or erased could try to come back in different forms. Perhaps it's a bit like looking at the arts. You know, the arts has different kinds of mediums, and each medium carries its own ways of aesthetic expressions, certain ideologies as well. And if we look at the guided tour thing, it could also be sitting in the spectrum of many other kinds of expressions. So yeah, so I think that's most probably what I'm thinking about. We don't have to wait for institutional structures in that sense. Yeah.
And
hello. Hi. Yeah, I'm Su Ching. Yeah, I'm just thinking about a few things that you guys mentioned. Sorry, I've been lurking for a long time. Yeah, so a few things is that number one thing, just now one guy, I think Gerald, mentioned something about us not having the anthropologists and the scientific structures in which we can remember. And then I thought that
sorry, you're cutting off.
their narrative. Hello?
Yeah, sorry,
sorry, my internet is not very good. Can I be heard?
We missed.
Yeah. I think my internet is. Just hold on.
It's okay.
Yeah, can y'all hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So just now, Gerald mentioned scientific ways of remembering, like anthropologists and the museums and so on, and not having that kind of scientific expert knowledge, to which then Wei Sheng mentioned that how we need to have different narratives and different actors in which to remember. And I thought of another word that we can add into the discussion. I thought this idea of affective ways of remembering, because can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So because on the one hand, you can have the scientific ways to remember, and you can you can be an archaeologist and dig into like all these things. But I thought that back to ghost stories, back to personal stories, any kind of narratives, they actually are great affective ways of remembering. That this idea of it's about tone. So the thing is, the AB Edu tours, this is my first time looking at it, but when I glimpsed through whatever it is, I thought that they remember quite well, but then the effective word is just very NE lah. So it's like okay, so if you have all the facts, but it's really a bit disgusting. Which is then you need like all these different smaller communities to have their independence and their own ways of remembering. And then I was also thinking about architectural structures, like what's it called? But anyway, so there's that, I can't remember the term, but the architectural structures that like the shop houses. Actually, we have a lot of shop houses. Like if you just do Google Earth and then you look over Singapore, tons and tons of shop houses. They are actually ways in which architecture is used to remember. But it's quite a shame that a lot of them, they are whitewashed, they are painted over, so a lot of their architectural details cannot be seen. and also these spaces are no longer activated. Instead, they often serve as office spaces for like swanky design office or that kind of thing. Yeah, so then it makes me also question that as much as I like architectural structures and I want them to be there, but I also wonder how are we using these architectural structures in as through effective ways to remember. And then for me, my last point is also y'all are nodding means y'all can hear me, right?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, so my last point is also the age at which we remember. So on one hand, there is people who remember because they have already lived through those times, so they can recount and then they can tell all these stories. And like before COVID broke out, I was actually walking around Chinatown because I was quite fascinated by the architecture. But then when I walk around, being on the ground, I realized that there was a contrast which many of y'all picked up that I found even more interesting also, which is that you have I mean, we all want to I'm gonna assume everyone here feels something for like the modernist icons, Pearl Bank, People's Park Complex and so on. But oftentimes when we look at the photographs, we are seeing the architecture once again because it's usually some kind of wide angle perspective. But when I walk around, I saw so many old people just sitting around the area. And I mean, I never got, I want to start talking to them, but I haven't gotten started yet. And I think they are, I'm going to guess, I think they are displaced. I think as much as we want to preserve these buildings, at the same time, you have all these people who have lived through a history that we want to remember, but then they are being forgotten. They are not being acknowledged as I don't think it's that easy because I think some of them are even difficult to talk to. I've seen like some of them are even cranky, the things that they say. But I think it's also how do we what is the place that we give to these people displaced from history. I'm sure Chinatown has become a very surreal space for all these old people that just want to hang out, but then they are not sure what to do with like these spaces that they don't know anymore. Yeah, so I think on one hand there's that, but on the other hand there's also people like me, like some of us that we don't live through that history. So then how do we remember? Because we are against, I don't really like museums sometimes because some of them they clean up the stuff too much. It's like how when they do architectural conservation, they whitewash over the architectural detailing that was actually there. But at the same time, for me, I'm wondering how do I remember, and what does remembering mean for me? Is it about recounting? Is it back to about keeping the effect with me through like personal stories that I pass on to people younger than me? Yeah, so for me, it's someone who doesn't live through that. What's the point of remembering, and how do I go about remembering? Yeah.
I feel like there's such a, I don't want to keep using the word violent, but I feel like there's this sense of like, you know, let's make a clean break from the past kind of thing. Like when I think about tours, right? Like I was just thinking about how earlier we were talking about like the Southern Islands, and then I was just thinking about how, okay, those were converted into landfill, some of them, but then you have like Kusu Island and St. John's Island, and then there are tours that go there that are for things like looking at places of worship. And, you know, like now we're talking about like the dead and ghosts and all that, right? And it's very interesting how like that has become some kind of freak show. And then also just like the last Campo in Singapore, Lorong Buangkok. And then it's like, that is also seen as like, this is some exotic part of our island. But do you know what I mean? Like there's this very strange sense of disconnect for me. Like actually this is something that shouldn't be seen that way, but it's just because the state has made all these sorts of I don't know, like let's develop this and let's do this, but there's no like real sense of consultation with the public and how we can move from the past to the present. You know, there's no continuity. So for me, it's like I think a lot of us are very divorced from that sense of memory or remembering because the state hasn't allowed us to come to terms with that development. It's just like we're gonna say A and then we're gonna do A and then you can deal with it later on. So yeah, for me the tours is like the idea that it's some kind of freak show, especially when we're talking about ghosts and places of worship and places of remembering our ancestors. Like I find that a very interesting like context in this discussion. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's easy to think about them as kind of anomalous given the context of like what's going on, right? Like you mentioned Kusu Island. I think so. I was doing a bit of research into that a while back for NHB, and then they were kind of talking about how in some cases it's kind of being reclaimed as a kind of just normal recreational space. It's kind of secularized and kind of made into a more mundane spot where you can just go and picnic and things like that. And I think you're right in like trying to say that maybe in using tours, I think that tours are a very specific way of understanding places, right? Much as a way like theaters, performances, or art are all different ways of interpreting and talking about a place, especially because I think in the context of maybe Sago Lane, a lot of the voices of people who can speak for themselves are kind of gone. And there's always a problem, how do we like kind of fairly represent the place without ventricualizing like their experiences or applying our own forms of rationality and stories and narratives to them. So I think it's a question that has no easy answer, definitely. And I'm wondering at the same time, like, you know, with tours, right? How do we kind of, I mean, what was the purpose of doing them? Is it pedagogical? Is it a way of maybe trying to get around architectural cataloging of like places, right? Like you mentioned just now, the fact that most of the time, if you are looking at the building as a structure, you strip away the human lives and ways that space is negotiated and understood. I mean, these are all kind of interesting ideas, which is why I quite like the Chinatown theater tour thing that you mentioned about. I think it kind of combines different ways of understanding a place. And, you know, that is one interesting format. And there's, of course, this practical question of like, how do you make it accessible to people? Are these kind of formats that everyone understands? Are these kind of like, you know, like in some senses, they are kind of Western forms of production as well that people conversant in the arts or arts educations or humanities educations can best navigate. And, you know, are these attractive enough? Because I think public history is always a very tricky question when it comes to how do we make sure heritage is accessible? Is the term heritage even the right one to be using to begin with? Are they just stories that we want to talk about in general? Yeah, just some thoughts that I had.
I think if we think about what is the purpose of remembering, like there's two things for me that come to mind. One is for us to remember our own experiences that we've gone through in the past, the emotions and the things that are important to us as individuals. And the other one is trying to build this kind of bridge to like the past, how do I put it? The experiences of people in the past. So like a tradition or a heritage that maybe we haven't gone through on our own, but our grandparents or our ancestors or people who have lived in Singapore before us have. So I think kind of a question that is difficult for me to think about is when we say that this place is important or this memory is important, then the question is important to whom? And I think what we're really struggling with here is how can the government do better to kind of take care of these kind of memories, or if they just can't, or if they're not interested in doing it, then how can civil society or just individuals like us be able to kind of emphasize more or protect this kind of heritage better? Because when I think about the places that are important to me, that I'm only 20 years old, but all the places that I remember from my childhood, a lot of them are gone. I'm never really sure if these are the same kind of places that are important to other people as well.
But I mean, back to the point about civil society. I mean, in the article, I think he also briefly mentioned like in the 70s, there's a erasure of a lot of the civil society experience pushback as well. To like, but I mean, of course, at that point, it was they were advocating for human rights and things like that. But I mean, I'm not associated with any civil society. I wonder what is the negotiation or things like that with them right now. And of course, like recently you also see like government trying to say like which is the good activist, which is the bad activist. Like, is that some kind of trying to like take control of the narrative as well? Like, and then like just now we also talk about like how actually we might need to explore even more informal way of structure to actually foster this kind of our own discourse or taking agency in that kind of oral history or things like that, you know.
Actually, what's very interesting to me about this text is how when we are talking about ghosts and we are talking about biopower or biopolitics, I did a word search earlier and the word fear is not in the text at all, but the word haunting or haunt appears like 11 or, so I think haunting is like 11 times and haunt is like 6 times or something like that. And I thought it's very interesting because when you talk about biopower, and especially in the Singapore context, like fear is such a big part of it, you know? And I think that there's some parallel with that and ghosts as well. But instead of using the word fear, they use the word haunting or haunt. So I question if that is a deliberate, thing that the author did. But yeah, I mean, like when I was reading this passage, like earlier, one of you mentioned like the army or something, and in the army they always talk about ghost stories. It's like a bonding, it's like a bonding ritual. You talk about ghost stories on Pulau Tekong, and then it's like a way to, it's like, okay, we're afraid of our Encik, so we're gonna talk about ghosts. It's like a different thing to like distract you. And to me, that's a very interesting. I don't know why this wasn't really discussed. I mean, the kind of like politics of fear or culture of fear, but yeah, I just thought it was a very interesting like.
I have
thing.
Josh on the phone now. If you can ask him again, what you just asked was the absence of the use of the word fear intentional, right? Like instead.
Oh, so you're gonna record me, is it? Okay. Let me try to repeat it. So I think it's very interesting how when we are talking about this text, right, like the word fear is mentioned. So I did a word search and the word fear didn't come up, but the word haunt comes up like 6 times, the word haunting comes up 11 times. And I question if that's like a deliberate choice that Joshua Komarov made when he wrote this text. And the reason I think about this is because when you talk about biopower in Singapore, like fear is such a big part of it, right? And then also like earlier someone mentioned like NS or the army. So I was saying earlier how in the army, like ghost stories are a very common way to create a bond between like the people in your platoon or people in your team or whatever. And it's a way of kind of like deflecting from the fear you have of doing NS or the fear you have of authority figures like your Encik or whatever. So to me, there's just very interesting thing that isn't really talked about in this text. And I just wanted to bring that up. Yeah.
Okay, let me ask him. I'm gonna send him this.
Yeah, okay.
Riz, I think the reason why they use haunt a lot is, one thing my theory is that is the romanticizing of fear, so it doesn't appear so violent. But I think the definition of the word haunt is to frequent. And this notion of returning back, coming back to something that has already gone away or is not there, is something very much a good representation of what we experience when we talk about remembering. How do you remember something that's already not there? How do you remember something that's already long gone or is absent or is removed or has been erased? So that's why it's very different from fear itself, because fear is very present. The fear of us losing our favorite joint, going to a place that it is still there. So the fear is there. The fear is something that is more insidious, more hidden. But then to be haunted is to like crave and long for that place that has already gone. I'm sorry, the person who is 20 years old saying that he lost all the places that was important to him. I think we all experienced that, and I think it's also how do we come to terms with that in a way whereby it doesn't in any way.
Oh, sorry, you're cutting off. I'm sorry.
Violate how we identify with our histories or with who we are, or how our history is like 5%. Trying to like figure
Can you
out.
repeat? Cannot hear you.
Her phone is like low bat. I can't send you the transfer.
Hey, say hi. Okay. Okay. Sorry. She's really scared of the phone. And people being in the phone. Hang on.
No problem.
Okay. I think I'm done on that. Yeah, but thanks, Riz, for bringing that up. I think that's a good observation, like in terms of fear and haunting. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean,
I was wondering maybe he also uses the idea of fear versus haunting, because haunting has this different metaphysical connotation to it, right? Maybe fear is a bit relational. You fear something for particular reasons, whether they're good or bad. But maybe haunting implies that it's tied to a specific space. Because I think when he later talks about how examples of kind of haunted double like topographies include things like where you kind of burn joss paper in HDBs, that kind of thing. It's kind of a subversion. Almost, and maybe like the sort of feeling that it is haunted because of all of these like disquiet histories exist in spite of whether people realize it or not. But I'm not sure, maybe I'm misreading like a bit of the article as well.
I think the appeal of ghost stories in a sense actually comes from its subversive nature, because as what Professor Komarov is trying to say in this article is that the idea of ghost stories or places that are haunted kind of escapes from authorities or like legal power or state power. And I think that's kind of what makes it something that people can bond over more naturally with. Because if you know like a ghost story, like let's say you went to like Woodlands Primary School or something, and you know all the Woodlands Primary School ghost stories, that kind of makes you part of this exclusive in-group. Like it's a set of memories that you can only share with people who have been through the same experiences as you, precisely because of the fact that these experiences are so hard to grasp, right? I mean, they're ghosts. There's no proof whether they exist or not. The only basis of the experience is that everyone that has heard about it kind of believes it or subscribe to it in some sense. And I think if we're talking about haunted places as a kind of like tourist attraction or something that the state tries to kind of legitimize, I was actually in Indonesia in January, in Semarang in central Java. It's a city, and the old Dutch railway headquarters is a place called Lawang Saju. So the whole building has been converted to a museum, but parts of it haven't been renovated yet. And the so-called like mythology behind the place is that the place is haunted, and that's actually part of the appeal for why so many people want to visit that place. But the parts that are actually haunted, supposedly, like the basement, are all closed off. So I think there's a kind of weird like dichotomy here between the state's kind of approach towards this Lawang Saju as a tourist attraction, because they don't really try and scrub away the fact that it's haunted, or they don't deny it. Like it's part of the appeal of the place. Without it, it wouldn't be so popular. But they also blocked off the exact spaces that are said to be haunted. So it's like they kind of accept it, but they're not really fully comfortable with the idea either. So they're kind of just letting it be as it is and letting people draw their own conclusions about the place, I feel.
If I may, my aunt actually lives in Semarang. So Lawang Sewu, right? They closed off the bottom area because it was the locals didn't want to encroach on the space because they really believed that the place was, haunted. So it wasn't sort of like an institutional thing. I think it was decided by the people themselves. Also, on that note, right? Like Ila mentioned the romanticization of fear. Am I right? The romanticization of fear. Yeah. So I was just thinking, this brought me back to like something that I read recently. It's a quote from Clifford Gates. I feel like this paper is kind of guilty of it, but I don't know. But I couldn't shake off the feeling that it was turning cultural analysis into a kind of like sociological aestheticism. That's in my that's the quote. So if people, Joshua Komarov's background is that he's quite he did it. I think he was doing his PhD in geography in UCLA when he was doing this. So he also has a very long history with horror for some reason. I think 2 years ago in State of Motion, he gave a talk about horror and architecture, which is also the name of one of his books published. And he also has a very long history with aesthetics as well, because he's part of Leka Architects, this duo in Singapore that does a lot of like experiments with aesthetics in space. So I'm wondering how valid is, him conflating a historical narrative, which is especially a feminine historical narrative, that of Cantonese women, with a critique of state power. It just seems to me like something that, it's exoticizing Singapore's overreach, the institutional overreach, And while he does address colonialism in that bit that Winnie pointed out just now to all of us, right? He did address that, the way how Raffles basically terraformed the entire Singapore even before the PAP took over. But that's just a paragraph, and, he is insinuating that the source of the fear and the haunting, right, is Chinese-rooted authoritarianism. which, while I agree is true, right? I feel like he didn't address the colonialism bit a lot, and I just don't think that it's very self-reflexive of him. This is off the record, by the way. Don't send this to Komroff or anything, please. Yeah, so I don't know. That's just what I felt through reading the entire article.
But I feel like it's very constructive. I mean, as some, if you don't mind, you can send him an email telling him this also. I think it's...
I'm very scared.
He's actually quite...
He got PhD.
What?
I think since you pointed out about how the kind of unmarried spinsters were kind of a sort of, how I say, like the PAP basically didn't really like their presence because it went against their national narratives of family or what womanhood's role in the family is. I'm wondering how much do you all still think that is applicable today? Like how much of that is down to the state itself as to why there's such expectation placed on women in Singaporean society, and whether that's still something that's relevant like about 15 years after this paper was written?
I feel like it still very much is relevant because like,
Leela, you're cutting off again. Can't hear.
like,
Oh my. Uh-oh.
She doing a soundscape piece.
Can you hear me? I
Yes.
just changed my Wi-Fi. So I think it's still very much applicable at this period that certain like if certain normative structures for women are still very much preferred for women to be married, not single, working, not full housewife. So it's still very much state led as how a woman should be in terms of the nation, or in terms, especially like if you think about like childcare, for example, like maternity leave for women who are single mothers is only half of the usual 4 months. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Instead of the 4 months, they get only 2 months. So there is kind of like a different treatment if you don't meet the normative structures that the government has put in place. And then a lot of the it's still very much applicable. I feel like this notion of like the unmarried woman, the stigma placed on it has very much been imbued into society that is also practiced ground up. Like if you're not married to a certain age, in like let's say a Malay household, you're seen as someone who is going against norms, and you should find a partner and all that. And so if you opt to be single, then you should at least like have a career or something. So there is different measures that you need to adhere to that is very much almost because of state policies many years back that has so-called continue until today. Yeah. But I agree that the article is like really exploitative. Like I agree with sorry, what's the person's name who mentioned about how like
Carol.
yes, it's very it's almost, the problem I have with it is that it's almost saying that the PAP control is the only like there is no subversiveness to this. There is no alternative to this. Like it has been cleaned up. It has been manicured. It has been controlled and possessed, and the state wins. And that's the one that I couldn't really like come to terms with in the article.
Totally.
Yeah.
I would assume that the responsibility, the academic responsibility in positing like this kind of narrative, right, would be to offer some optimism, or at least a sense of like an avenue for reprieve, and notwithstanding the fact that he uses ghost stories, which has always been the colonial narrative, since day one of colonialism in Singapore. How like the Mem Sahibs talk about how the slaves in their household, tell them these ghost stories, and they really happened. The Annie Hall stuff in the Caribbean and stuff like that. I think he's just using a trope. Yeah, if I may.
Asian academic tropes. Yes.
He also
I think it
mentions like
does.
the Russell Lee ghost stories or something, right?
Yes.
Those were like hugely popular. At least when I was in primary school, it's like whenever they sell in the bookstore, everyone lines up to buy it. It's very interesting, like the power that these stories have. Like even for young children, it's like this sense of something is missing in our, I don't know, like society or in our life, and we need to find it because it's a nice like distraction or a nice like thing that no one talks about.
I think ghost stories are quite a nice foil if I think about it along the trajectories of coloniality in terms of how, if I think a lot of us are westernized in terms of the knowledges that we grow up with, or as long as we are in higher spaces of learning or even education, it's still largely a Western way of understanding in terms of rationality. And I think in Singapore, to prize math, science, finance, those kinds of things are echoes of coloniality. So in that sense, ghost stories are helpful interventions or trying to foil that, because it defies all kinds of logic. You can't quite explain it with science. You can't quite explain it with teleology. And sometimes even within religious circles, there's only a limit that it has in trying to explain the supernatural. So I think it's yet a foil on one hand, and to the other, it's also the space where it's the everyday people's imaginations of space, imaginations of histories, imaginations of relations, and even cosmos. So I think to see ghost stories as a kind of intervention to, for lack of a better word, to try and recover some form of subaltern or the everyday space of people, I think that's actually quite a nice trajectory that we could think about. Yeah. So also then perhaps we could think about what else is possible to add to the repertoire that functions quite like ghost stories, a foil to rationality. And it is from the everyday spaces, everyday people's experiences and lives, and even stories passed down from generations. Yeah, so I think that's quite interesting. Yeah, thing. So I'm not too sure whether if Ila has anything to share, because you said you were collecting ghost stories as well.
I think like in the context of this, right, when we think about urbanism or the kind of modernization where things have been removed, like communities have been removed, houses have been removed, and buildings have been like destroyed and all that, there are stories of like areas where this kind of urbanization cannot take place until today. So one of it is actually a shrine at a mosque. This shrine is belonging to this very religious man named Habib Noor, and they had to build the highway over the mosque, because every time they try to remove the mosque, the machinery actually shuts down. So there are stories of where the haunting resists modernization, resists any kind of urbanization or progress or changes made to the land. So there are stories such as this, and I know like during construction, each time if they do construction work, there will be cases where they have to have a shrine or a medium that comes to actually like read the land and to make offerings so that the construction goes through. And even within like theater companies, when they have like shows at Fort Canning and all that, they actually call like mediums to come in to bless the space. Because there is a kind of like, it's almost like interspecies in that sense, where we have to like work together with the spirits, and the spirits reside there stubbornly refusing to move, and we have to kind of like be obliged to meet their demands of utilizing their space. So I feel like this kind of navigations and negotiations would be a very interesting addition to the reading, in terms of like not every time the government wins in terms of controlling a land. And not every time the story is so tragic. I feel like certain memories still live on, even though the land has been taken away. Certain memories do still get passed on in that sense. So it's it's bleak, yes, but it's not completely tragic in that sense. Yeah. I don't know whether that's an add-on that you wanted.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about how perhaps the current view is it's always an antithesis, like the state is evil and all bad and all controlling and intervenes every aspect of life. But I actually think it's not very true. I mean, from the circles that we work with and walk in, there is also spaces and pockets to resist or re-exist, actually, not just resist. So I'm thinking very hard about such spaces, whether they need to be informal, they need to be a kind of disappearing act, but it sticks with us. So it's a different kind of memory, a different kind of archive, and what kind of possibilities it will come in. But of course, to throw in a spanner, I also want to think about the idea of hegemony, that there are actors who try to desist, but there's also a group of people that agree with what the state is saying. So the state is allowed to be what it is because people also give certain consent and allowance to it, and in that sense, I think that complicates the picture, because if we think about the kinds of narratives we want to form, the narratives we want to remember, it cannot just be, okay, state narrative versus people who, desist. Yeah, then where's the intermediary? So that's why I think ghost stories, it kind of got to my imagination how it could be that. Yeah, and then of course thinking if there's anything else that is quite similar to ghost stories. Yeah. So
just thinking for the article, right, actually it was written in 2007, so I'm not familiar with the cultural scene in 2007, but I was just wondering, because today we a lot of people are looking into heritage. NHB even they set up some intangible cultural heritage thing that they are looking into and so on. But I was wondering, in 2007 was the, I don't know, maybe the prevailing, if there's such a thing, prevailing academic narrative, even in Singapore, was it such that it was a very state versus ground actors thing, and the state always wins? Because I think if I think back to some articles that I might have read in 2007, well, from 2007, there's this magazine called Spores or something like that. It the way they frame it as the way they write the articles, I think, is also quite in a similar tone. It was always a state versus ground actors, and then state usually will win. Yeah, so that I don't really have an answer. It's just a thought that I'm wondering. And then the second thing, just now Wei-Sheng mentioned about the consent that people submit to hegemony, the extent to which people would just let the state or the totalizing narrative take over. I'm also linking this back to biopower, or even this idea of fear, because actually I thought that the mention of fear versus haunting is very interesting, because when we talk about the biopower that the state exerts on us, especially in Singapore, it really is out of fear. That even like today, it's like I mean, I trust the government a lot. When it comes to dealing with COVID, I'm scared, I want to listen to them, and that is the kind of biopower that they're exerting over us. And it has never stopped, in terms of like them telling us, oh look, if you don't let us develop this land, we cannot progress, then we'll all be poor, then you won't get to like live your comfortable life with the aircon and so on. Yeah, so to me, that kind is biopower that we hegemony or not, we are scared lah. Yeah, so yeah, I think in Singapore more so than in other places lah. I'm not a rich person. I cannot like just fuck it and just like go against the government, that kind of thing. Yeah, so then I think the it's very strong lah, this power over us. Yeah.
I mean, I think staying a year in Hong Kong has made me think very hard about the idea of civil society. Because it came to the protest, definitely not a government initiative. When it comes to fighting the COVID, forget about government initiative, and the ground definitely moved a lot faster. So I think the so-called political consciousness of people, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not like suddenly I realize that one side is bad and one side is good. Whether that is even real or not, I'm not too sure. And perhaps, I mean, what I learned from the Hong Kong people, at least the students, is that there's a kind of curiosity always to ask if life has to be like that. I mean, I cannot equate the living conditions in Hong Kong to Singapore, because Singapore is definitely comfortable in terms of housing space, but Hong Kong is a lot more comfortable in terms of a different kind of space that encourages them to think about things beyond what they can see, or to think about the future, to think about generational differences and how that has panned out through policies, through housing, through even space, how space is used. So I think perhaps Singapore has been very smart in that the aircon nation definitely worked. And it has definitely perhaps shaped our certain desires and even expectations of what we think a good and successful life is. But I think COVID-19 has also begged the difficult question if our comfortable aircon life has been built on the broken backs of a lot of these foreign workers. So then the question is, are we uncomfortable with things like that? And of course, foreign workers is only the tip of the iceberg. So I think for Hong Kong students, there's this curiosity that they're not quite willing to settle. Also because there's a suspicion towards government, which I think perhaps a lot of Singaporeans like you and I initially lack. Yeah, and I would like to actually think that suspicion is good. Yeah, pain is good. Mental pain, yeah. And I think Hong Kong and Singapore are constantly being compared to one another. I think Hong Kong thrives much better in terms of ability to think, ability to rally together. And I think if there's a crisis, I do think Hong Kongers weather it a lot better than Singapore as a society, I think. So perhaps those are also things for us to think about. What are the kinds of histories and memories that we would like to start to form and keep so that society becomes a bit better, not just in terms of the material, but if there's anything that happens to society again, is Singapore robust enough to last through? Yeah. Yeah. So that's perhaps why I keep thinking about civil society. But of course, civil society has a huge baggage also, because the idea of civil society is still predicated on the Western understanding of the social contract and state and government. So I think a few weeks ago, a few of us read the book by Chen Kuan-Sing called Asia as Method. And there was another chapter where Chen Kuan-Sing was talking about his realization that he cannot kind of impose the Western understanding of civil society to how he understands his own Taiwanese society. And he looked to a scholar from India. And India obviously is a different context. And from India's context, he realized he was understanding civil society quite differently. So perhaps that's something that we could start thinking about as well. Yeah, but yeah, just some of my thoughts.
I mean, in the article itself, he also compare like Kong Si with the clan. Like one is more like, like the actually in like, for instance, like different civil society have its own power structure as well, and things like that like are not so widely talked about now. And is it because like civil society nowadays like doesn't have that much power or like traction, or what is the reason of like this not being talked about as well? And yes, of course, like you say, the form of civil society in existence like in the West or in Asia is completely different. And in class, like when we were doing like something about public art and then public spaces, like we talk about the notion of civil society, and my prof is from German, so first thing that she questioned is like, what is civil society in the context of Singapore? Like in the West, or in where she was from, like civil society always is rooted in religion, but for us, I only can think about clans, and it was rooted in the regionality or like the form of migration or trade. But then, of course, that I didn't know too much about civil society. And now I read this article, and in Kongsi, it's like it's basically a culture that like it's not exactly religion, but then looking at it like that, there is a form of some kind of religion structure to it too, like how there's a very restricted way of living or things that you do, like a very strict code of conduct as well, things like that. And I, yeah, like for now, and then look at like what we are right now in Singapore, what is the form of civil society that is forming, like, or is it like, or in relation to civil society and as well as like decentralized or grassroots movement, what's the format, or like what's the, how to say, I will use the word again, conjuring power, like to like form society or organization like that, or is it just mere community building? And it's this sounds a bit maybe it's not the right word, or like it's not PC, but I'm actually glad that like there's more room for negotiation in like different format of how we can form a civil society now, because like the structure is not as clear, and then they don't have a very, how to say, strong power in the, like it's still quite a fresh field in our context for us to build on this whole notion.
Actually, what you mentioned like reminds me of when Singapore had the Marxist conspiracy, and they were able to find a lot of people who were involved because a lot of them were involved with the Catholic Church. So there's some like link to like religion, at least for something that was talked about in our society and gets a lot of, you know, people talking and noticing what's going on. Like that was one instance where I guess maybe religion was able to form a part of civil society, at least in its early stages. So that's something I thought of. Also, I was thinking if I could maybe read something from the text.
Yes.
Unless we want to keep talking about this. Yeah, so I wanted to read, actually, this is a footnote. It's not part of the main text, but since, so someone mentioned earlier, I think Wishing it was you mentioned about something about foreign laborers. And one of the footnotes talks about how there's a link between migrants and ghosts. So footnote 46 on page 73.
73.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the footnote is based on, so the footnote is for the film on The Maid that links it to ghosts. Yeah. So the footnote says, migrants and ghosts seem indeed to have a special affinity, as both are, in an important sense, spectral figures within Singaporean society. As Derrida observes in Spectres of Marx, the spectral, as the word implies, contains a meaning of periodicity. Ghosts come and go, making brief but disruptive appearances. I will argue that mobile domestic labor carries a similar frisson, and perhaps it is this perception of the maid's role as disruptive that has led to the draconian legal constraints on their lives in the island nation. I don't think I need to read the rest of it, but I came across this because while I was doing my word searches, and I was thinking about the word spectral, you know, as a relation to ghosts. So I thought this is a very interesting footnote because, you know, it's like earlier we were talking about conjuring and like imagination and remembering, and I think the word spectral and ghosts like have a very interesting sort of like intertext kind of, you know, connection. So yeah, I think now with this discussion that we're having about how, you know, most of the COVID-19 cases are coming from the migrant labor like community, yeah, the idea that there's kind of this brief but disruptive appearance in relation to this topic about ghosts, like I find it very fascinating. But yeah, I guess just the idea of like deviance, you know, ghosts creating that deviance and giving us a way to reimagine things. I just thought this was a very interesting point.
Oh, then I should really share with you this article. So it's also by Komarov. So initially I thought we were reading Komarov as in this Komarov. It's by Jean and John Komarov.
Well,
So
that's his parents.
is it really?
His parents.
Oh, wow. Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So his parents actually wrote
Study in Africa, right?
yeah. So it's the Alien Nation. So we talk about spectral. They wrote about zombies, immigrants, the idea of capitalism, extraction of labor, and this spectral presence of these immigrants as well. Oh, I didn't know they were related that way.
Yeah, they came to my school to do a lecture on labor, on a little bit related to future of labor.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see that in yeah, never mind. That's different from this topic. But I mean, please share the link.
Okay.
Then I can publish it on IG or here.
Do you want me to upload it onto the Google Drive?
Yes, can. Or you can just link it to
okay
the chat, the group chat here also can. Just now on labor. Yes. Goes as a disruptive.
Okay, I hope the file goes through.
Yes, it's here. I can see it.
Okay.
Then we can look at it when we.
Yeah, it's just that powerful surnames.
But talking about that, right? Also migrant labor, like it was fascinating for me because I like the relationship between this like how to call it, this labor to, because they live with them every day. I mean, not me. I mean, people who has the domestic help, and then the relation of like the domestic help and yourself, like they are literally in your personal domain every day. But like how, like with this, there was like they're making the relation to migrant labor with the ghost as a form of deviant or like something that's different from you, right? And how do you negotiate that? Because I don't have a personal relationship like of such. I don't know how to like articulate it as well. And then I only know it through my friend's work, Geraldine Kang. In her work, she talks about like how growing up with her domestic helper actually shapes a lot on her perception in life, as well as like how to deal with this dynamic. But like, do any of you have like similar or experience or things like that can articulate that better? Like,
I mean, I was thinking like in terms of specters, right? Like earlier Linus made this point about whether or not we still see the same like gender, things that PAP tries to implement on society. And I feel like the migrant labor community is a very good example of that, because it's very gender. It's like you have construction workers and you have shipyard workers and you have domestic helpers, right? And that is completely dominated by your gender. So I think it's very interesting how like, because you see this, where did this, I don't know if it was a study or some kind of policy paper, but they published something about how after the PAP made they did their family policy about how you can buy BTOs and what makes you eligible and things like that. That's when they did very aggressive hiring policies for foreign laborers to come in and like meet those needs. So it's like, now we want all our female Singaporeans to go to work, but we want them to work in service industries. So now who's going to take care of the kids, right? So it's like, actually, all that labor that was taken care of in a very gendered way is now like outsourced. And it's, in a way, I feel like that's a very strong example of like kind of this spectral capitalism that in this paper that Wei Sheng just shared with us. So I feel like to me is a very interesting like example of how, even though we don't really talk about how there's this, I don't know, like gender division of labor, it's actually very apparent. Like if you actually look a little deeper, it's very apparent. And like, yeah, Aware has statistics, MOM has statistics, and then you talk to like Transient Workers Matter too by Jonathan Wen. they have all sorts of like articles on this topic as well.
Mhm.
So yeah, to me, like the kind of like the spectral capitalism that comes from a very gendered like lens is very apparent.
I haven't read the article, but sorry, what was the point I was about trying to come across? Oh yeah, and then in the article, I mean, sorry, this is not related to what you just said, but it talks about the how to say the what's that accommodation terms for the labor, like how actually the amas they choose to live on their own. Maybe that how to put it in words, and putting in this in perspective of what it is now, like you were saying, gender labor, and then how actually the domestic worker do not have their personal domain, they stay with us, and then while the male domestic worker, I mean the male migrant workers, they have their own housing, right? And this might not be related to what you just said, but like I had this discussion with my friend in private, like she believes that actually having their own housing and to for the domestic worker actually give them more power and agency in the way of living too. And then yeah, I'm trying very hard to relate to what you just said, but then now I cannot make the connection, you know. But I somehow feel like there's a connection there. Like yeah, and in Marjie's case, you can see that this how to say agency is like it's enabled by them having the place on their own, a very physical place. Yeah, I don't know whether that is actually related to what you just said, but yeah. And then how do but the like for I mean coming back to what we have today for the construction worker, they have their own housing. But how does the power for them to actually come together to actually negotiate their terms not being able to realize in for like how the amas did in the past? Yeah. Sorry, I don't know whether that is related. I'm trying very hard to relate to.
Okay. Actually, I'm also
I
thinking.
guess we're talking about whether they're disruptive or not, right? Like, I mean, to me, that's the whole point. Is like making that connection between ghosts and migrant laborers, like kind of whole idea that they are disruptive. And in this context, where we're talking about how most of the cases come from this community, a lot of people who don't understand the struggles they go through are like, actually, circuit breaker could be over if we didn't have so many cases from that community, which they don't consider part of like Singaporean society. So in that regard, it's seen as disruptive. So yeah, I mean, like to me, that's where the idea of like them being disruptive comes in. Sorry, we wishing you had a point.
I mean, the talk about the migrant workers, and again, I'm looking back at this article. Perhaps okay. I mean, I think it's also maybe not fair for him to write about everything. But the notion of race as well is not quite considered here. Or that when Komarov talks about the Kongsi, talks about the Ama, talks about Confucius' so-called Asian values, I wonder whether there's an assumption that Chineseness is universalized. Like, you know, it's normalized. It is the standard for Singapore. So I'm wondering, you know, if unfortunately Ila is not here. I'm just wondering if we look to other non-Chinese spaces and histories and spatialities, whether the same or similar story or outcome would be like that for an article. And I'm saying this not because I'm treating race as a universal category, but because in the context of Singapore, policies are racialized to a large extent, spaces are also racialized to a huge extent as well. So in a sense, it is convenient because it has already given us that relatively neat space of race category and space to work with as well. Because I'm thinking if Singapore was like a migrant kind of place in the early histories. There were a lot of Indian migrant workers that came in as well. What happens to those spaces? Yeah, I'm sure the current Little India is not their hangout space when they were migrants, pre-independence and so on. So I think maybe this article, didn't quite consider race in that sense. Yeah. So yeah, I'm just wondering if race was considered, would it have also changed certain directions? Would civil society be as how he cultures it as well? Yeah, because Asian values is really
what's Asian
values. Yeah, so
I think from the stories that Ila shared just now, that they're like about the ghostly stories, that there are similar like stories from other races also. Sorry.
Yeah, I guess what piqued my interest was because on page 63, under the heading Bones of Contention, so Komrov quotes Lee Kong and Brenda Yeo's work about funeral landscapes. And there's this paragraph that he says, in brief, concerns about available land as well as hygiene caused the state to mandate the rather un-Chinese and decidedly un-Muslim alternative of cremation and columbarium as the only solution for the island's future. And then it goes on to talk about the elaborate Chinese graveyards. Then I went, I don't think the Malays would agree for cremation in that sense as well. So I guess it's immediately related to power. Do they have power to decide that they don't want cremation? But then we are in a land scarce Singapore. So then how do those things contend? And then so that story or that voice is something that I don't quite hear under this bones of contention as well. So I mean, of course he chose Chinatown, so obviously then it decides a certain trajectory as well. Of course, then my other question is, surely Chinatown was not largely Chinese as well, pre-independent Singapore days. Yeah. So yeah, just some questions as I look through the article again.
I think the main sense I get is that like it kind of underscores how important physical space is and the control of it, because memories also relate to that. Like when you have when the space is gone and all these previous former houses are cleared off, even if you have tours, there's nothing to see, and then that's why there are all these people in Chinatown who are the old people who are lost, because they can't see anything that relates to their earlier lives. So I'm a bit skeptical about his conclusion that even though the state is so controlling, these ghostly aspects can help to combat it. Though I like what you suggested just now, that spaces of resistance can be ephemeral and ghostly. Maybe that's one strategy, but not very, doesn't sound very convincing.
But I mean, let's not talk about fear, but like you say, ghosts or haunting is always something that is always relating to something that in societies that is not resolved, and then it will become some kind of embodied knowledge in us. So yeah, that's why I mean, maybe that's my perspective of how I perceive haunt as well as fear. It may not be a form of fear. This haunting maybe is some kind of embodied language as well as knowledge. And then I guess that's my reading of what he mean by biopower. because I mean this is very far-fetched or it might sound cuckoo, but then I do believe that sometimes when like some people say that they have like remembering of things that they thought that's their past life or things like that, like or spooky incident or like of such, like you suddenly have some knowledge that you don't think that is like is related to your physical being right here in this life, like this kind of thing. That I think that's my reading of what he mean by biopower and as a form of resistance. Like unresolved social or cultural issue will always haunt us in a certain way. Like it's almost just it's almost like positioned in a way that we don't have the power over it because the whole like the visitation, right? You talk about that the knowledge and things like that comes to you without you try to without you trying to like even perceive it or things like that, like unresolved things that you have to deal with. I guess I don't know how true is that or how can that be proven.
I mean, I wonder if maybe that has something to do with how a lot of you know, discussions around like indigenous sovereignty is about. It's like you have an agreement made between the developer of the land and someone who owns the land, right? And then because of a lot of colonial violence, a lot of that didn't happen. So it's like for example, you know, very stark example is like New Zealand and Australia, right? Like New Zealand has their treaty with the Maori people, but Australia, the land was never officially ceded to the Aboriginal people. So there's this kind of like idea that Australia is somehow a little bit cursed because that ceding didn't happen, that cessation didn't happen, or like there was no agreement made between the, you know, the owners of the land and the people who settle. So I think I mean, for me, like when I think, yeah, I at least in this context, like, I think maybe this idea of like, not just appeasing the people who own the land, but appeasing the spirits and the people who have inhabited the place for a long time. Maybe that's one reading of it to me, like as far as land sovereignty goes and like ceding the land to the original inhabitants and having that agreement. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, and also that's like a new perspective to look at sociology as well. Like just down SC right mentioned about affective or like even new materialism. Like they are latent. I mean, I don't know how much you can prove that, but like just a different way of looking at things like that, like social or cultural issue. Like maybe there's latent knowledge that are embedded within environment, like let's say affect is like ambience kind of thing, or like in material that like in new materialism, like things like maybe my cup is trying to tell me something or things like that, like they have embedded knowledge, you know. Maybe that kind of thing come up and then surface to us through this kind of haunting as well as like ghostly encounter, like the words like so much used in this kind of theory, right? So I mean, it's a good thing is I feel like that is really a breakthrough in terms of like cultural or social studies, like just take a step back and then look at things for not with your perception being the first thing. Yeah, that's ghosty and haunting. Oh my god, I realized that most people already left. But yeah, very good discussion, man. And then like I was thinking like, basically a small group meeting, like this whole session will gonna last like until circuit breaker's over. But in some form I do want to get people's contact, like although a lot of people already left. Like maybe like at some point we can have some kind of more tangible, more physical, or at least some kind of connection. And Ila left her email here, and then of course like and not trying to put her in a pedestal, but yes, she does have a different kind of knowledge from a different community that can share with us. Yeah, today I asked her to come over because I also very scared like putting her on a pedestal, like I say like, I want to have a very different perspective from a different community. But yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of the things that talk about in this article can only be talk about with someone that's outside of this community. Yeah, like things that can share. And then so like although she left already, but later I'm gonna text her and then say very thankful that she shared all the amazing project. Like, but on top of that, I was thinking like more on like intergenerational kind of knowledge in the context of Singapore. And it's strangely like I feel like it's only things that are in the article is only happened in the 70s. It's not very far away. Maybe it's just a generation or two away. And all those things that I know about this is not from the reading, not from any academic reading or things like that, but it's from intergenerational knowledge passing through. Or like, but then that make me question about how it is for Singapore, or like not my generation, maybe people who are younger, like how do they get this type of embedded knowledge? We can't, I mean, although it's a very good like notion of haunting ghost story or like new materialism, like latent knowledge and things like that will come and then visit us, but is there a more tangible way to passing through this type of conversation? Maybe it's a prop for us to talk more to our parents. Today is like Mother's Day. Let's talk more to our parents and our grandparents, or maybe like what SC was trying to say, like talk to the old people in Chinatown or everyone like that. They all have their embedded, not so latent kind of knowledge, right? And it's strange, and I'm glad to have platform like that we are in here. We are putting everyone in a subject position here also. Like we can all share our embodied knowledge without any visitation, I hope. And the CB thing and the whole mukbang reading camp. Please leave me your contact or things like that. I was just saying this, but I have your contact, so it's fine. Guys, please, give me your contact or things like that if you want to like reconnect or things like that. But for this session, for reading camp for this year, or at least be keeping it in like a 10 episode kind of blog. But we will always bring it back again after circuit breaker, things like that. But so just wanted to put it out here first. But although since there's still quite a number of us here, so
Thanks for hosting. It's really learn a lot from the discussion.
I would hope that people give me more article to read also. I'm like, because like if it's me, right, I have this very like information cocoon thing. It'll be just be this type of article. You can see that, of course it's good for our discussion also, because we always talk about what's Asianness, a little bit about colonialism, a little bit about actually biopower or actually haunting or conjuring. But I would love to read more on any other thing too.
I posted one on the Google folder.
Oh, you did? Okay, sorry. I've been like doing my thesis on this few days. So next year you can read that.
But it's also related to biopower, so I don't know. It is about this ability.
We can like continue just thinking like a more I don't know to call it decentralized or not, like more like sources, where we can find more articles. It can be fun article too. Maybe Okay, I think that's it for today. Thank you for coming.
Thanks everyone.
That's I think 2 or 3 more weeks, right? To hope everyone doing well. Bye. I'll see you next week. See you next week. Hello, everyone. Are you guys still here? Vivian, Shauna. Or is it just me? No. Who's Jin? Hello, Vivian. Are you still there? Oh, Wei Qing. That's my friend. Okay, can. But I want to talk to Shauna a bit first. What's Vivian doing here? Vivian, can I just kick you off? Hello. Okay, this is strange. What's Vivian doing? What's she not doing?
Vivian went off to do something, then come back.
Let me go to the toilet first. Then I'll just sum it up a bit. Aiyo. Is Vivian back? I don't know how to get people off the group chat. How do I can't kick her off or something like that, you know.
Cannot.
Remove, okay.
Sorry, bye-bye.
She can't be rejoined. She can't rejoin. She will not be able to rejoin the meeting, it says.
This meeting lah, this Zoom.
Really? Then I just put I just put her in waiting room. Yes.
Yeah. She can wait.
Wow, today I'm like a lot of awkward moments, yeah. I cannot.
I was like, should I come on and help you finish your thought? Because I know what you're thinking. You just like, the words just like, it's damn funny. Like, then like everyone today is like, they got monologue on, you know. I'm like, guys, your monologue is very long. Veron today never come, right?
Veron never come.
Someone, I think cause Veron always see Facebook Live on already, then she come on. Then today never do Facebook Live, what?
I don't know why cannot. It says like my
Your other screen, right? I was like, I don't know how to rectify it.
Yeah.
You need on-site tech support.
Yeah, and it's strange. I didn't touch anything, and basically I updated the Chrome also.
Still didn't work lah.
Yeah. I try again now, just to test it out. Wow, everyone like, wow, shit, a lot of thoughts, yeah.
Good. A lot of things to say, like
good
and bad kind, you know. It's not like very one-sided conversation.
Articulate, I cannot. I'm so amazed. 很厉害，大家都。